Hi everyone, welcome to Art Before Words. Today our guest is Sam Maclean. Coming from a background of film criticism, he now researches independent Chinese cinema from the late 1980s to early 2000s. The first time I met him was when he came to interview my mother for his research. We talked about Chinese film for a long time, and before we realized it was already midnight. He always carried with him a list of lost movies, which, in his own words, he has scoured the deepest recesses of the industry and of academia to find. He also told us that his great-great-uncle is Edgar Snow, the American journalist who introduced the Chinese Communist movement to the Western world with his 1937 book, Red Star Over China. I had read the book before as part of our Chinese curriculum. At that time, I had no idea that generations later, one of Snow's own family members would embark on yet another border-crossing journey. For someone who grew up in the US, how did Sam Maclean come to focus on Chinese cinema, and why this particular era of film that even the Chinese have more or less forgotten? Let us start today's episode. So just a few weeks ago, you came back from a trip in China where you did quite a bit of research. How was it?
It was great. I was really there for two reasons. I was invited by Beida to go to a conference at Beida for the 120th anniversary of Edgar Snow's birth, and so I was excited to do that. But it also allowed me to go back to Beijing. They let me stay for a long period of time. And so I took the opportunity to do my own research while I was there, which involves a lot of filmmakers that I've written about in the past, some people I've met in the past and interviewed in the past. And sort of at the core of that was interviewing a group of four filmmakers who have been friends for over 30 years, who've worked in the system at CCTV and at Beijing TV specifically, and have done some really pretty radical, in some cases quietly radical, in some cases more outwardly rebellious things, but from within the system. And I wanted to tell their story, both because they have had a real important impact on film, the way that film is developed in China, and in particular documentary film, but also because they've been friends for so long. So I wanted to try to tell their personal story as well as their professional story. And I think I did a decent job of doing that. But once I get through all the footage, I have probably 40 hours of footage, 40 hours of interviews, and then interviews shot from different angles. So probably over 100 hours of footage to go through, and we'll see how it all shakes out. But I'm excited about it.
Mm. What kind of questions do you ask them?
Yeah, so what I personally, I don't think I'm a very good interviewer. And so that's always been kind of a hurdle in terms of doing this work. That's hurdle number one. The second hurdle is that my Chinese is not very good. So I've always had to rely on translators. I think that my approach to interviewing, it's rooted in my writing. So first I was writing about these filmmakers and writing about them mainly as a film critic, because I was a film critic for 15 years, and that's sort of what I do think I have a talent at. But then I started really being interested in the sort of the stories behind these films, whether it's the production histories of individual films or these filmmakers' personal experiences throughout their careers. And I wanted to understand that to sort of influence the way that I was writing about them critically, or at least to give some context to it. So I started doing these oral history interviews, which were very low maintenance for me because I would basically ask these simple prompt questions like, so you made X film in X year. What was that like? And then just listen to them talk and get the story of it. But then I started realizing that actually it was a professor at Harvard where I work, named Ligia, who told me when I was telling her about the work that I was doing and the writing and the book that I was working on, she sort of perked up her interest when I mentioned these oral history interviews that I was doing and said, "Oh, that sounds the most interesting about what you've talked to me about." And so I kind of started to recognize between her saying that and me looking at the content of these interviews that it's really valuable. And whether or not I'm a good interviewer or not, I'm at least the catalyst. I'm the person that's there to listen to these stories and to capture them on film. And there's something really particularly powerful, I think, about oral history in a video context because you can absorb someone's story in a number of different ways in different mediums. You can read it in a book or an article or whatever, where you get the details, the narrative details, but you don't get the emotional inflection of the individual, whether it's their voice or their image, them telling these stories. And obviously there are podcasts or audio interviews, and you get the inflection of the voice, so it gets a little bit closer to the emotional experience of the story. But oral history video or oral history documentary is a really unique and powerful expression of film to me, of documentary, because you get to experience these people's stories, the narrative details of the stories, but also all the emotional inflection of their voice and their face. And, it's kind of a simple concept, but to me, it's very, very powerful. And so that was sort of how I approached doing these interviews. But when I decided to do this film and go to China, and it's a film project. It's not just like recording an oral history interview. So I did a lot of preparation for that. But it's my first big sort of interview project. And I kind of came to realize a couple of things. One is obviously the language barrier makes it difficult. I was using in the past when I've done interviews with Chinese filmmakers, I've used a human translator who will basically stop them when they're giving an answer so that they can do their translation for me. I didn't want to do that for this project for two reasons. One, because of the advances in technology, particularly in AI technology. I had experimented a little bit with this, and my limited Chinese combined with the sophistication of AI made it so that basically I could put a phone in front of me, have a little earpiece in, and listen to them talking, and it would translate it in real time. And it wasn't perfect, but it was enough that I could get, what I needed to ask follow-up questions. And then when I asked my follow-up questions, the human translator would just translate those. So it was kind of a new way to approach doing. I'm sure other people are doing this, but for me, it was new. And it was mostly successful, but there were limitations to it. The AI is always a little bit lagging behind, and so it's harder to kind of interject and ask a question because the timing is kind of off. So I was kind of struggling with that a little bit. But I think that the breadth of the stuff that these guys talked about, their personal experiences through a whole range of Chinese history, they were all born in the late 1950s, early 1960s. They gave reflections on their professional lives and how the political and social atmosphere in China affected and distorted what they wanted to do and or hindered what they were trying to do. And so I think I got a nice cross section of different time periods and different sort of perspectives on being an artist or specifically being a documentarian in China during this whole time period. So I'm proud of the work. We'll see how it all comes together as I edit.
How long have you been working on it? And like, how do you see the end product coming out?
Yeah. So I mean, this was really the first. I went and I did the filming, and this is the first like filming for this project. But the roots of it really go back to around the time of the pandemic. So when I eventually came back from China and finally went to college, went to Columbia and did my degree in East Asian Studies. I really focused on that period of film history. It's not a requirement to do a senior thesis, and it requires a lot of sort of planning and coordination with a professor, which was very difficult to do during the pandemic with everybody quarantined and working remote. But I'd still done the work myself during that time, and part of that work was reaching out and talking to filmmakers from that era. And the four guys that I did this documentary on just now, they were among the group. Two of them were among the group of people that I had reached out to. So that's kind of the very beginning of that film project. Um, and I think also I gradually started to recognize that what mattered to me more than just writing about these films was finding ways to make people aware of them and find an audience for them, basically get them exposure. And so basically what happened was I would read about these films when I was in school, and even before I was in school. I would read Chris Berry and Zhang Jin and uh, Dai Jinhua has written about some films, and all these basically scholars writing about this time period. And they'd be writing about these films that aren't accessible, that people couldn't really see. And I wanted to know why. So I kind of started to go look for these films, first from university libraries here in the US, which didn't go very well. It was hard to find these films still. And when I was able to find them, there was all sorts of gatekeeping that kind of prevented being able to get to them. Um, and so what ended up being the most effective way to get to these films was to talk to the filmmakers directly. They were more receptive than scholars or university library systems. The filmmakers were actually really happy to talk to me. And they wanted me to see their films and write about them. And I was kind of taken aback by how much they actually wanted their work to be seen. Because I think my perception from reading about them in these books by scholars was that, oh, they probably were willing to have like scholars write about them, but they didn't want them to be widely seen because these are largely banned films or suppressed films. And so they're sensitive. And so that was my expectation was even if these filmmakers were willing to let me see these films as a scholar, they probably wouldn't want to do much more than that, or they would want to like caution me to not share them or something like that. But generally, that wasn't the experience that I had. And I started to wonder why that was. And there's basically two reasons that I've come up with. One is a more charitable reading, and one is a less charitable reading of scholars. And the more charitable reading, which I tend to think is mostly the case, is that a lot of these filmmakers, um, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when scholarship, in particular Western scholarship, was really focused on this time period, the 1990s, the early 2000s. That's the period that I really focus on. Um, they those filmmakers who had made independent films or made underground films were all of an age that they had to keep working. And so they had mostly gone and worked in the system, whether it was at CCTV or local regional stations or just some other state, position. They were working. And so I think that they would have probably been scared at that time to have this work that's been banned or, censored to be more widely seen. But the reality now of contacting these people because of the age is that they're all retirement age. And now being retired, they seem to really want this work to be seen. The less charitable reading would just be that scholars who write about this stuff in the past are doing a bit of gatekeeping themselves and they care about this work so that they can kind of advance their own reputation as scholars, but that they're not all that invested in helping the filmmakers. Um, I would guess it's probably a little bit of both. But what I started to realize, what I cared about a lot was helping these film. If they want their films to be seen, I think that they should be seen. And we can get into why I think it's important for their films to be seen later. But that was kind of the beginning of thinking about ways other than just writing about these films to get them attention and to get them an audience. And this film that I decided to make is kind of an extension of that goal.
朋友们，西藏自治区成立30周年庆祝大会现在开始。
I'll follow up a question on your connection with Edgar Snow. How do you view his work in China?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Edgar's work. I read Red Star Over China when I was younger. I thought it was a pretty, and I reread it recently when I went to the conference. I still think it's a pretty engaging read. I think he's quite a important leverage point for Chinese communist Maoist propaganda. I mean, I think he was a very effective messenger for the rest of the world to not necessarily understand Maoism and communism, but to know that this was out there, that this was happening. Um, I read some stuff and cringe at sort of his fawning uh, uh, affection for this the Red Army and for what he's seeing in kind of a bit of a oversimplified view of the world. I think that what I said in my speech that I gave at these two conferences that I went to is that I think his approach to writing is a very sort of traditional and uh, nuts and bolts form of journalism that I think a lot of things are happening in the world today that kind of show us that brand of journalism doesn't really fully account for the complexities of this world. What Lois said, his widow, and I don't know how much, I totally believe it or don't believe it. I didn't know him and I didn't know her, but Lois said that towards the end of Edgar's life, he started to recognize sort of failings of his own ability to uh, parse the reality of Mao's China. In particular, his later books, supposedly he regretted some of the things that he wrote when he went back to visit China later, at the same time that a famine was happening, and there's all these horrible political campaigns. Maybe he saw them and saw what he wanted to see, or maybe Mao was very effective in terms of how he, um, you know, uh, uh, constructed his what he was able to see of China and what he didn't see. Um, I think that he didn't understand China enough. He didn't understand the mechanics of this political movement that he was following. But I think that he the role that he played in helping people understand what was happening is he's an important part of history. And I think it's certainly interesting to me to be related to that. Um, so I think the bottom line with how I feel about Edgar is that I don't think he accurately represented uh, what was happening really at any point that he was covering uh, China under Mao, whether it was during his early time in Yan'an or later when he went back. Um, and I think that the reason for that is a combination of, like I said before, the failings of a traditional form of journalism and just his cultural remove from the situation. He doesn't, he's not Chinese. He doesn't understand China as intimately as I think maybe he thought he did. Um, but as a writer, as someone, deeply involved in and following this important political moment, I think his legacy is very important. And I do think that there are examples in his work. Again, I reread Red Star before I went to China this time, and I was struck at least by him. There are moments in that book when he recognizes a failing of the Red Army of Mao and Yan'an, and it's down to Mao, and it's the idea that nobody can kind of go against what he says, and like what he says has to be accepted. So even he kind of recognized early signs of this cult of personality. But when people talk about Red Star, they talk about Edgar today in China. Obviously, they don't look at any of those nuances. They look at, Edgar was a friend of a foreign friend of China and was a champion of Maoism and communism. And I think that that's probably an oversimplification of his legacy, but it's also fair to some extent.
Mhm. When you talked about Edgar, you mentioned like maybe he had difficulty understanding the full cultural context. And when you were in China, have you ever had similar feelings, or like you mentioned language barriers? Did you ever have the feeling that you were like a foreigner? What was it like?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Every day, every hour that I'm there. I don't think I have any of what could be called Edgar's delusions of like thinking that he, understands this culture. I don't think Edgar's Chinese was much better than mine from the snippets of what I've heard him speak. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I think that's what I struggle with a lot with the research that I do is, why I'm the person who's doing it. I do think I've devoted so much of my time and energy and, efforts to learn about this stuff and to understand, what's really a fairly narrow portion of Chinese cultural identity. Although I'm also very interested in Chinese music too, but Chinese film and Chinese music are my two sort of passions. But um, I think I just kind of try to tell myself when I feel culturally alienated or like I'm not, fully understanding what's happening around me, that the stuff that I'm capturing, whether it's in what I'm writing or what I'm documenting on video in these interviews, it's valuable. Like, even if I don't necessarily understand the full scope of it, somebody will. And so I think that's what kind of pushes me to keep going. And I do see the results of what I've done. The what kind of helps me when I worry about how if I'm the appropriate person to be doing this stuff. The series Tiananmen, which was made by Shi Jian and Chen Jue, two co-directors at CCTV. It was shot in 1988, 1989, and then canceled after the protests started. It was not about the protests originally. It was about what Beijing was like at the end of the 1980s. And then when it was revived as an independent film, that context, that socio-political context was kind of imposed onto it by the filmmakers. Not imposed, but it was added into the film. And so I think it's a really, really valuable work, one of the great works of Chinese documentary that I've encountered. And it hasn't ever had never been shown in full before. And because of the effort that I made to talk to these filmmakers and convince them that it was worth showing it, we were able to show it twice. We showed it at a screening in Chicago um, about a year ago, and last October we were able to show all 8 episodes at Harvard for a fairly decent sized audience, especially for something that's 7 hours long. And people were really, really moved by it. And so, whatever my limitations are, language wise, cultural understanding wise, I do think that I've been able to bring some of this work to light. And if I'm able to do that, that's really the legacy that I care about the most.
Mm. You mentioned like making the documentary, screenings, writing a book. So what are the things that you're doing recently, like the projects you're working on?
Yeah. So the book was kind of the start of it. A book came from me working as a film critic and then going to school at Columbia and learning more about Chinese film and realizing that this is the period that I wanted to focus on. The book was originally just going to be kind of a collection of my critical writings on these films. And I thought that in itself was valuable just because some of the scholars who write about this stuff are not film critics, so they're kind of just writing about it, as scholars and kind of giving the background on these films, but not necessarily uh, assessing them critically, because some of them are very successful, some of them are not very successful, and there are aesthetic reasons why they are or are not successful, um, and ideological reasons too. But as I started working on that, I realized that I wanted to know more about the background behind these films. And so that led me to do these oral history interviews. And when I did the oral history interviews, I realized that these production histories of these films, and the biographies that I was hearing from these filmmakers were also really interesting. And so the book kind of ballooned into this larger project of juxtaposing my sort of critical assessment of these films with a kind of historical background. So each chapter is kind of bifurcated in that way. Um, and then I was continuing to work on that when I got the job at Harvard. So I work at Harvard as the communications manager at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And my boss is also a journalist, Dinda Elliott. She was the bureau chief at Newsweek in Beijing in the 1980s. And so she, in the early 1990s. And so she has a similar kind of interest in me, as me in this time period, um, and the same, journalist background. So she supported my work when she found out that I was doing this. And she wanted me to kind of bring it into the Fairbanks Center in some way. And so that's how the film screening that we have done started. And when I talked to people uh, at the center, some of them said, these interviews are really interesting. Why don't you do, a film instead of a book? And, I'm a writer, I'm not a filmmaker. I did go to film school, interestingly enough, but it was sort of a short period at film school, and then I left. Um, and so I've made some films before, and I've done a lot of video editing for the Fairbanks Center. That's part of my job description. But I've never made like a full length documentary film before. But I decided that basically I want to do anything that I think uh, plays into what is my core goal. And my core goal is getting these films seen, getting attention for them, getting attention for the filmmakers, getting attention for their careers and their bodies of work. And so when I saw this film as a possibility to do that, to tell the story of these filmmakers, um, that's how I decided to, or that's why I decided to do it. And in terms of how I see the film taking shape, um, I want it to be largely these interviews that I've done with them, but I want to juxtapose the interviews with sequences from their films. So a lot of the questions I asked were kind of drawing out some descriptive detail about why they shot a film, shot a scene a certain way, or why they chose this particular subject. And I think there's some, I like the idea of juxtaposing them talking about this work with scenes from the work, especially since the films are not accessible anywhere at the moment. So it's kind of a way to, maybe someone doesn't want to go to a screening of a 7-hour film. I can't necessarily blame them for that. But if they watch a 90-minute film, 90-minute documentary, and it's someone explaining why this work is important, and select scenes from that film, that might make them more interested to want to see the full film. And so that's kind of how I'm envisioning it. And I will say that there's a kind of template for that. So there's a film critic, film writer named Tony Raines, who's sort of a godhead of Chinese film, and he used to make these short documentaries on Chinese filmmakers. He made one on Chinese uh, animated directors, um, animation directors, and he made one on the fifth generation directors. And he did a very similar approach where he would just do these sort of short interview segments with the filmmakers and then cut together sections or excerpts of their films with a narration that kind of broadly contextualized all of it. And I think it's a really great way to sort of be introduced to this work. And so I want to try to do something similar with these filmmakers and their work.
我们爱护你，就是爱护自己。我们拥有你，就是拥有自己。
I was a film critic for 15 years. During that time, I worked a lot of different odd jobs to support myself, and I kind of avoided going to college. I didn't want to rack up student debt, which now I'm in student debt for the rest of my life. So I didn't succeed in that. But my plan was to try to avoid it and work these jobs. I was living in New York. Cumulatively, I lived in New York for about 10 years. And in 2000, around 2011, the second I got laid off for the second time in 1 year, different jobs. And the reason for that was really kind of the residual effects of the economic recession in the US. And so I kind of felt like I'd reached a dead end, or at least financial dead end, not being able to sustain myself in New York anymore. So I kind of revisited, or just thought about what my other options were, whether it's going back to school finally or moving somewhere else. And China has always been a constant presence in my life since I was young because of my relation or my family history with Edgar Snow. I learned about Edgar Snow. I learned about his writing when I was younger. I'm by no means an expert on his work, but he was a journalist. I'm a journalist, and we're both interested in China. And my interest in China, it was there at that time, but it kind of flowered more when I went to China. So I decided to go. I did some courses in teaching English as a second language, and I went and I lived in China for 2 years. And my passion as a film critic just kind of melded with my cultural surrounding, and I decided to learn more about Chinese film history. I watched, some of the oldest existing Chinese films, which are from the 1920s, and just kind of tried to learn about all the different phases of Chinese film history. And during that time, I became interested, in particular, in the 1990s films. So when I eventually came back from China and finally went to college, went to Columbia and did my degree in East Asian Studies, I really focused on that period of film history.
交融作无限的温馨，世间充满着生命的和谐。
About finding the old films, um, was it pretty hard?
Yeah, it was definitely hard. Um, I think, I basically tried three different things. I tried to go to university libraries, especially here in the States. Um, and I'll just say that was a very dispiriting experience because, a lot of these films, they're because they were suppressed or they were censored, there aren't a lot of copies of them. And some of them the filmmakers don't even have anymore. But there are films, for instance, at UCSD, University of California, San Diego. They have them on burned DVD-Rs, uh, and they're in some cases very possibly the only copies of these films. Because like I said, I've talked to some of the filmmakers and they don't have copies of them. Um, and the problem with just burning something on a DVD-R is they have about a 15-year half-life. And so because these films aren't, being backed up on hard drives and I know part of this is just the university system doesn't have a lot of manpower and there are a lot of restoring and archiving projects going on. But it's just sad to see some of these films basically just be lost because they're on old technology and haven't been properly, taken care of. So the university library system, I wasn't able to get too much out of. The second thing I tried was talking to scholars, and some scholars were very, very helpful in terms of helping me find certain films or connecting me with people who might have them and things like that. Um, but I think a lot of scholars they don't really even have the films themselves. Maybe they saw them a long time ago, and so that was kind of a dead end for the most part. But what really worked out the best option for locating these films was talking to directors directly. Certainly, a lot of the filmmakers don't have their work anymore, and I had to trace all sorts of strange, you know, trails of clues to find films in different places. Um, but I will say the filmmakers that did have their films, a lot of them, wanted their work to be seen. And it wasn't just that they wanted them to be seen by me, they wanted them to be seen by a wider audience. Um, so it took a lot of perseverance and you know working with like translator apps and stuff and talking to lots of people on WeChat and things like that. But uh, I think at the end of the day, all that work was worth it. I have lots and lots of films that I feel at least they've been digitized. I mean, a lot of the films that I located were on old tapes, and so the tapes had to be digitized. Some of them were film prints, and the film prints had to be digitized. The tapes are the most concerning ones because, not to get too in the weeds on technology, but basically, um, there are beta tapes and there are U-matic tapes from particularly from the era that I'm studying. There were a lot of things preserved on those two tape formats. Beta tapes are a little bit better. U-matic tapes are really not good. The technology is not good. And so a lot of films that I was able to locate that were on U-matic tapes, the magnetic strip of the U-matic tape degrades very, very easily, especially if it's not kept in in good storage. And so a lot of films were lost because those magnetic strips deteriorate. Um, but yeah, I think it's worth the effort to make sure that these films are preserved and hopefully, you know, can do something to bring them to more people's attention.
What are the some of the weirdest places where you have found films?
So there's a filmmaker, his name is Fu Hongxing, and Fu Hongxing was the former, I think he was the former director of the China Film Archive. So he has at a very high rank. He's known in China because he directed a film about Zhou Enlai from 1998 that was like the second highest grossing box office film of that year. But in the 1980s, his first job, he grew up in Shanghai, but he moved to Beijing in, I believe, 1986. And he got a job at what's called, I always get the name of this studio wrong, but I think it's the China Newsreel and Documentary Film Studio. And this is a film studio that had been around since the founding of the Republic, and documented, sort of the political history of China. When he arrived at this company, he mentioned arriving at this archive, basically, this film studio, and seeing the work that they had in their archive, and just this vast, scope of modern Chinese history, and just being kind of overwhelmed by it, and it being his kind of coming to Jesus moment. Anyway, so he started working for the studio, and in the 1980s, he shot a lot of short documentaries shot on, I think, 16 millimeter film. And some of them are about like Catholicism in China. Some are about vocational schools in Beijing, or the like some are about like new technologies. Um, and he also made some films in Tibet. But these were 16 millimeter film prints, and they were produced, apparently primarily to be sent overseas, to be sent to the US, sent to Europe, to kind of educate people about China. And this was, again, the mid 1980s to late 1980s. And I was aware that he made these films. I had originally started contacting him to ask about his work, and he sent me some of his films, but most of them he didn't have copies of, or the copies that he did have were very, very low quality. And um, I managed to track down the actual 16 millimeter film prints of basically all of the films that he made in the 1980s. They were at a university archive in, I believe, South Carolina. And I asked them to digitize them. And of course, first they were like, no, we're not doing that. We don't, that's not, we're not going to do that for you. But then I got the filmmaker to write a letter, and he, it's his work. His name is on all the films. So luckily they were willing to do that. They were willing to digitize the films. And I was able to give copies of the films then to the filmmaker. Uh, but that was kind of a strange place to find films. A lot of the other sort of oddball places is mainly just tapes in people's houses, like these old beta tapes. There was one of the filmmakers of the four guys that I interviewed. He has a house filled with beta tapes and pneumatic tapes. And myself and my research partner, one of my research partners in Beijing, basically went to his house and took like 30 tapes and digitized all these tapes. And it's a mix of like stuff that actually aired on Beijing TV, stuff that didn't air, didn't pass censorship, and like raw footage of unedited things. There's a lot of interesting materials there. But yeah, it's always fun to find things in unexpected places.
Hmm. What was it like to work with and interview these directors? And are there any like memorable stories or experiences that you would like to share?
Sure. So the guy I just talked about, Fu Hongxing, when I interviewed him, I went and interviewed him at his house, and it was a 12-hour interview. So it was very, very long. But I just got to hear, the full breadth of this guy's life and his career. He told me basically his whole story, his personal biography and the story of his films and stuff like that. And it was just really, impressive and an exciting, you know, experience. A couple other occasions that I find really memorable. There's kind of the most famous, or not most famous, but the most sort of representative figure of what's called the sixth generation of Chinese filmmakers is this guy Zhang Yuan. And Zhang Yuan's ex-wife, her name is Ning Dai, and she was his screenwriter for a lot of his films. And she also directed one film herself, which, like many of the work that I, uh, do my research on, is not an accessible film, but she has a copy of it and she provided it to me. It's a very interesting film documentary. But anyway, I interviewed her over basically three interviews. And for one thing, as a woman working in this scene and being around in the early 1990s and stuff, she has a really unique perspective that she offers. And she was just very emotionally unguarded. She would talk about the kinds of stuff that her and her then husband were up against with censorship and, the various figures in this movement and people that she had relationships with who she saw, deal with uh, hardship and, various obstacles in their art. And she was just a very expressive and moving person to interview. And when someone's willing to share that kind of, feeling with you, that kind of experience with you, it's kind of a bonding moment. And I'm very appreciative of, the stories that they shared with me.
Hmm. What's the greatest difficulty you face when you do this work?
I think it's the language barrier for sure. Part of it is it's not even always about the interviews, but it's like I think that I have a really I'm very attentive to this work and to these films and to what these filmmakers are trying to express. I spend a lot of time thinking about it and writing about it. And I can't just directly communicate that to them. There are filmmakers that I've met who understand that and, you know, through patient, getting to know each other and working with translators and stuff, they can come to understand how I feel about their work and how I feel about them and their importance and understand who I am as a person and what my values are. And I've become very close with those filmmakers. But it takes that extra sort of I have to break through that barrier, that literal sort of language barrier to get to that place sometimes. So I think if I was able to just speak directly and speak, fluently in Chinese, I wouldn't have to worry about that as much. So I think that's really the biggest challenge doing this work. And I think a lot of Western scholars who do things in China have this problem of just the language barrier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, why do you feel drawn to this era of Chinese independent film in particular?
Hmm. Yeah, so I was thinking about this a lot recently, and I think, I feel that China's national cinema has it's very fractured. Like its identity is very fractured. And I think if you look at it, there are a lot of reasons for that. So I mentioned earlier, some of the earliest extant Chinese films are from the 1920s. There aren't that many from the 1920s that still exist. And that's sort of and even in the 1930s, there are a lot of missing films. Basically, there's a whole era of Chinese film that is pockmarked and missing, so many important works because of war and conflict. And so that era of Chinese film is fractured. And then you have the Mao era, and in the Mao era, there are these very specific restrictions placed on the kinds of films that can be made, and you have mostly revolutionary operas made during that 10-year period, and it so that kind of affects the capacity for Chinese national cinema to kind of form its identity. And those two things are kind of unavoidable. The films that were lost for due to war and conflict, they're probably not coming back. Every once in a while, some film gets found, and you know, it turns out there's a film that people didn't know still exists. But and then the stuff happening during Mao's time, obviously, it's just films that weren't made, and so they're not coming back. But the period after that, during opening and reform, after the Cultural Revolution, you have I think what I like to call a kind of Goldilocks zone of a lot of filmmakers who are given this freedom or this comparable ability to express themselves, more political freedom, especially in the mid to late 1980s. And you have a lot of really interesting art that's being made in that time. And you also have filmmakers who they're exposed to what's happening in the West because of the opening and reform, but there's not a like oversaturation of that. Like some of them who went to film school would see Italian neorealism films and Soviet films and stuff like that, but they weren't inundated like we are today with all kinds of media from everywhere. And so that's why I call it a kind of Goldilocks zone. There's an international cinema history that they can draw on, but it's limited in terms of how much they could be influenced by it. And those conditions created a reason or a, a motivation for these filmmakers to be more creative and more innovative. And there are so many really great films from that late 1980s throughout the 1990s, early 2000s period of those filmmakers that were just being innovative, and basically they had a subject that they wanted to make a film about. They didn't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of filmmaking, but they kind of had to develop strategies to tell that story, whether it was a documentary or a fiction film. Um, and I think that after the advent of the internet, that changes a bit. And I think you see it in Chinese cinema post, the mid 2000s, where a lot of Chinese underground, I like to call it underground or non-mainstream cinema. So it's not necessarily just independent film, because I think independent film is a kind of difficult tag in China and requires a lot of considerations as to what independent means. But if you think about underground or non-mainstream film after the mid 2000s, a lot of that is just very homogenized. It feels of a piece with the rest of global international cinema. And I don't think that's the case for the stuff that was made in the 1990s. I think there's a really sort of unique identity to that stuff. And I think the reason that we see now it being so homogenized is because of all these fractures that happened to Chinese uh, national film's identity, these missing pieces. And so my feeling is if you can restore at least this period of history, this 1990s, late 80s, early 2000s period, on all these films that were suppressed and censored and that have just been kind of buried, if you can bring those back and have people recognize them and bring them into the discourse on Chinese cinema, it could really kind of change the way that people think about Chinese national cinema, and people could kind of see the progression more of how that cinema took shape, and it might, um, shake out what I think is kind of a stagnancy in Chinese cinema right now. Because I think right now in Chinese cinema, you basically have um, at least in terms of how it looks to the rest of the world, you've got these major figures like Jia Zhengke or Wang Bing, who kind of define what people expect out of Chinese film. So especially again in this non-mainstream underground or art house international festival kind of audience, people look for the next, version of those filmmakers. And so to feed the market, like a lot of Chinese filmmakers are trying to do that. Like they're either doing these, austere kind of slow cinema, art house stuff, or for like the narrative film, or in the documentary space, it's like very DIY. It's very, DV, like handheld, just sort of observing, what Chinese society is like. And oftentimes it's like showing the negative sides of Chinese society and stuff like that. But I think that if people had more of an awareness of Chinese film history, and especially that period that's so, suppressed, then people could try to like break out of that. Because if you look at other national cinemas, there are periods when there are like very famous filmmakers, very sort of representative filmmakers of the national cinema, and it kind of stagnates that national cinema because everybody wants to sort of pile on that trend. And what tends to break those national cinemas out of that holding pattern is when they do something that's innovative or different and that draws on their own national cinema history. And I think China is just in a position where it's not able to do that as well. And I think that there's a possibility for that to change if these films are unearthed and people kind of recognize them and they become more part of the discourse.
Mm, I agree. I also think
Good. I'm glad somebody does.
I feel like it takes a lot of guts and grit to, cross borders and really dig into this kind of lost history of this um, politically suppressed era of independent film. So, and before this, you weren't really working in this field, like in particular. So, do you think you would have spotted signs of the work you're doing today in who you were as a younger person?
Hmm. Interesting question. Um, hmm. Can I answer that? I think that a lot of what I do now draws on different periods of stuff that I've done in the past. And I guess, what kind of centers anything that I do right now is working at Harvard. And the role that I have at Harvard is really special to me because it does combine so much stuff that I've done in the past. When I went to high school, I went to a vocational school and did graphic arts. In my role at Harvard now, I design all the posters and design all the, brochures and social media posts and all that stuff. When after high school, when I did try to go to college briefly, I went to film school. Now I'm doing all the video editing and video production for our stuff at Harvard. And after leaving film school, and really while I was in film school too, I worked for a long period of time as a writer, as a film critic, and a journalist in different capacities. And now at the Fairbanks Center, I do blog posts and I do, for the film series, I write the press language for the films and stuff like that. So I'm in a role that takes all these different sort of things that I did at different stages of my life and kind of combines them and makes them one coherent thing. Something that like both my family and past partners always thought wasn't ever going to happen. That me sort of uh, cycling through all these different career paths was never going to amount to like one coherent thing. Um, and I think because I have that like that centering, career basically, I'm able to do this work. I had and it all kind of radiates from my role at Harvard. Um, there's legitimacy to what I do because I'm able to show these films at Harvard. I'm able to, get the support of my executive director at the Fairbanks Center, and um, but I think that I've always been interested in film and been interested in journalism. And at the end of the day, what I'm doing combines those two things in some way. And trying to sort of editorialize and understand the work of these people as people and the work of their work, the work that they produced, and trying to critically assess that stuff. Um, yeah, I think there is a through line to my career, even if it's a little bit of a hard one to parse sometimes.
Mm. How about even younger? Like if your 10-year-old or 16-year-old self heard about what you're doing today, what would he say?
Well, I think that one, when I was 10 years old, probably the most important person in my life was my grandfather. Um, I always had a bit of a difficult relationship with my dad, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. But my grandfather was kind of the rock in my life. And I look at the stuff that I'm doing today, and it does go back to what I learned as a kid from him. My grandfather instilled in me a love of film. My grandfather was Edgar Snow's nephew and actually knew Edgar, like he was his uncle. So, he spent time with him. And so I learned about Edgar Snow from my grandfather. And so I think certainly the 10-year-old me was aware of Edgar Snow. And for 10-year-old me to know that like I went to a conference for Edgar Snow's 120th anniversary and stuff, I think they probably would find that pretty interesting. So I think there is some connection there. Uh, yeah, it's those same things. It's film and journalism and sort of my family's ties to China. Those were things that were very much percolating in my childhood. They weren't necessarily like the things I was focused on the most as a 10-year-old, but they were there. They were present in my life. And now obviously they play a much bigger role.
Do you see a theme in the Chinese independent cinema from the 1980s to early 2000s?
Yeah, I do. I think that you have to sort of accept two things to be able to recognize a theme or what I would even call a movement. And that's that you can't do what a lot of scholars do, which is separate documentaries and narrative film. It just doesn't make sense because there's a lot of overlap. The guy who is probably most representative of sixth generation cinema, and basically, sixth generation cinema is usually considered like narrative films. And the new documentary movement obviously is documentaries. But the guy who's most representative of the sixth generation cinema, Zhang Yuan, he made a lot of documentary films. And he made one documentary, The Square from 1994, with Duan Jinchuan, who's one of the central figures of the new documentary movement. So I think there's definitely a connection between these two things. If you accept that connection, then I think a movement kind of starts to take shape. And I think that the I used to think maybe like independent, the definition of independent film was kind of the unifying factor. I don't really feel that way anymore. I think that independent is a difficult thing to parse in the context of Chinese filmmaking because independent financially is almost non-existent, and you could label it as independent from state ideology, but that's a bit of a slippery thing too. I think the tag that I tend to use is underground or non-mainstream film. And I think a lot of the filmmakers who basically made their first films in the late 1980s, made their first films as directors in the late 1980s and first half of the 1990s, and who were born, say, in the between the mid 1950s and at the very latest, the early 1970s. They had a similar, experience. They're of a similar generational cohort, and I think they process the world in a way that there's a certain coherence between it. And I think um, that the reason why I sort of draw the line in the early 2000s is because I think a lot of things change after that point. For one thing, in 2002, Wang Bing's film Tieshi Chu, West of the Tracks, comes out. And to me, that's unlike any other film that was made before that. It's 7 hours long. It's, just formally very, very different. For its DV, it just kind of starts a new era of Chinese film for me. But I think that the films that were made in the late 1980s up until the early 2000s, there's a similar kind of sense of like these filmmakers were drawing on what influences were available to them and then combining that with whatever creative and innovative energies they had to kind of develop their own voices as filmmakers. And I think that era, as I've said before, is kind of a Goldilocks zone for that. Whereas after the early 2000s, when the internet starts entering the picture, that there's a much broader sphere of influence for those filmmakers, and it just feels very different to me.
Mm. Mm. What do you hope today's audiences take away from that history of filmmaking? And what do you hope it leaves behind for the world to remember or to learn?
Sure. I hope that I'm able to get it to a broader audience. And, what I'm doing to do that right now is I've done some screenings at Harvard, and that's really just the first step. I've actually just started working with an archive that has a very similar sort of way of approaching this stuff as I do. They want more people to be able to see the work. And one of the things I did when I was in Beijing was talk to these filmmakers about this archive and about this opportunity for their work to be seen. And the goal, the plan right now is to set up some public screenings at various places, really all over the world, or at least Europe and the US, and show these films a handful of times in spaces where you can provide context for them. You can have a conversation with the audience and with the presenters and kind of build some amount of buzz for these films. It's kind of a soft rollout. Uh, Instead of just dumping them onto YouTube and then just putting them into the void and
Mhm.
everybody's information or attention deficit just means that they'll never be properly appreciated. If we can do these screenings and build some buzz because people want to come out and see something that they have no way of seeing, you can't just search it online and find it. Um, then I think putting them online and making them widely accessible is a more responsible thing. It's not responsible to do that and just throw it into the void. But if you've established some level of context, if you've managed to put these films in the discourse of Chinese film or of international film or whatever, Chinese film history, then I think making them widely accessible is good. And hopefully, over time, people will find these films. They'll start, thinking about them and recognizing them as part of this history. And that's really what would be my ultimate goal, is if they're recognized and people's understanding of this era of Chinese film develops. And in the process of that development, these filmmakers who really are not appreciated as well as I think that they should be, their legacies are elevated. And yeah, that would make me very happy, much more happy than publishing a book or putting out a movie. If this work is properly appreciated that these filmmakers made, then that's me feeling like I did the job I wanted to do.